Deep Sea Embers Chapter 251 to 260. Chapter 251 Inches the Deep Sea. Listening to Tyrion's account, Duncan became lost in thought for a brief moment. After about 30 seconds, he lifted his head and spoke pensively. So, she initiated the Abyss plan, out of curiosity, but its true nature isn't about exploring some lower planes, but rather, a literal dive into deep water. As he said this, he paused, sensing something peculiar about the situation. But if that's all there is to it, how is this project connected to the vanished subspace where the vanished disappeared and the deep sea the Frost Queen aimed to explore are two distinct concepts? The rebels shouldn't be so muddled that they can't even differentiate between the two. Tyrion didn't reply directly but instead posed a question. Don't you find it odd? If it's merely about diving into the water to investigate the underwater conditions of the city-state, what's so taboo about it? Harbor builders and offshore fishermen in the city-state frequently dive for work purposes, and it's common for them to descend safely to tens of meters. Why has the Frost Queen's Abyss plan become taboo? Duncan's expression grew serious. How deep did you go? Extremely deep, incredibly deep. I'm unsure of the exact depth the Queen reached because I'm not a scholar myself. I only participated as a naval commander, offering some peripheral support, and I wasn't directly engaged in the actions during the latter half of the project. However, as far as I'm aware, before the project began to go awry, their manned submersible had descended to at least 1,000 meters underwater, and they consistently broke that record. 1,000 meters underwater. Duncan rapidly processed the information in his mind. On Earth, this seemingly insignificant number is, in fact, the limit for many advanced military submarines, with most capable of diving only to depths of 400 to 500 meters. Records of extreme deep dives reaching several thousand or even close to 10,000 meters are typically achieved by specially designed deep diving equipment in a short duration, requiring high-quality equipment and often unmanned. At the time, the Frost Queen's manned submersible had already reached the 1,000 meters threshold. Given the industrial level of this world half a century ago, this was already a remarkable feat, even with the aid of some supernatural powers. And behind this remarkable number, it appeared to have brought something even more astounding. Tyrion previously mentioned that the project gradually went wrong in its later stages, and Duncan didn't miss this detail. Ads by PubFuture. He gazed at Tyrion, his eyes intensifying. I want to know the specifics of the entire exploration project, whatever part you were involved in, tell me about it. Perhaps because he had already answered numerous questions and grown accustomed to this kind of conversation, Tyrion didn't hesitate for long this time. He delved into his memories and began to recount slowly. Apart from the Frost Queen's Abyss plan, the recorded human conventional diving depth, or safe water depth, is 150 meters, restricted to nearshore areas. Our project initially started at this depth, and everything proceeded smoothly until we reached 300 meters. At that depth, it was already incredibly dark. Sunlight from the surface couldn't penetrate such a thick layer of water, and the high-powered lights on the submersible could only illuminate a small area. To investigate the structure beneath the city-state's islands and avoid dangerous creatures in the open sea as much as possible, like deep-sea offspring heirs, we had the submersible dive along the coast and moved close to the island's nearshore areas. I still remember the description provided by the explorer when he resurfaced. He said that beneath the island was something like a rough and unsightly pillar, covered with thick calcareous deposits, and some peculiar creatures lived in the pits of the deposits. Other than the pillar, there was nothing else, just darkness. A pillar beneath the island. Duncan couldn't help but interrupt Tyrion. Not a gradually expanding support structure, but a pillar. Yes, at least that's the case for Frost. Tyrion nodded. Is there an issue with that? Duncan shook his head. Number issue, continue. Tyrion gathered his thoughts and resumed sharing his past experiences. That was the scene at a depth of about 300 meters, which was the limit of the first submersible. After realizing that this depth wasn't sufficient for deep-sea exploration, the Queen instructed the scholars to construct a second submersible. This one was highly successful, reaching a depth of 800 meters in a single dive. And through half a meter of high-strength glass, the explorer still observed a pillar, a straight pillar. Of course, In comparison to the city-state's radius, this pillar, of at least 800 meters in length, was still relatively short in proportion. Instead of a support column, it was more like a normal, disc-shaped base supporting the island. Subsequently, we built a third submersible. Due to technical constraints, the advancements of this submersible were much more modest than the second one. It had to carefully dive and challenge the record set by the second submersible. It was during this gradual descent, meter by meter, that we discovered something. The pillar beneath the city-state was actually only 850 meters tall. Beyond that, there was nothing. The entire structure was floating in the seawater. Ads by PubFuture. Tyrion paused and looked into Duncan's eyes. Now do you understand why I said earlier that it's more like a disc-shaped base than a pillar? November LBJNN. Duncan furrowed his brow. He remained silent but quickly visualized the entire structure in his mind based on Tyrion's description. In the deep-sea era, people lived in cramped conditions in the city-states. Initially, Duncan believed these maritime islands were crowded and narrow, but in reality, as functional, self-sufficient living spaces, these city-states were certain to have a sizable foundation. Although there were some smaller islands, the foundation radius of most large cities that had a name spanned tens or even dozens of kilometers. As the largest city-state in the cold sea, Frost would not be smaller than this number. Corresponding to this massive maritime structure was its underwater base, that was only 850 meters deep. When the explorers first glimpsed the underwater part of the city-state at a depth of 300 meters extending straight into the deep sea, they instinctively imagined it as a pillar reaching the ocean floor. However, in terms of proportion, the shape of this pillar more closely resembled a thin floating disk in proportion to the radius of the island that's resting on it. As Tyrion described it, the entire structure was floating in the seawater. Nevertheless, when Duncan envisioned this model, a significant question arose in his mind: was every city-state like this? If every city-state was like this, all being foundationless, floating objects, then how could they be so stable? If the city-state's own stability was due to their large size, then how could the stable relative positions between the city-states be explained? Despite the endless rolling waves, these floating islands never changed position. Why? Duncan expressed his doubts, but Tyrion merely shook his head. We also had doubts about this, but in the end, we couldn't figure it out. And compared to what happened later, the question of how the city-states float on the sea became insignificant. What happened later? Duncan couldn't help but feel curious. What exactly did you see in the deep sea? Later, the third submersible continued to challenge the extreme depth. We spent nearly 2 years pushing the record from 850 meters to 950 meters. As you can imagine, during this diving process, the submersible gradually moved away from the city-state's base. Do you remember what I mentioned earlier? To avoid problems in the open sea area, we had the submersible dive in the nearshore safety zone, close to the coast. Throughout this process, the submersible was actually always near the city-state and the underwater structure of the island. But as the dive continued, the explorer moved away from the base, and things began to go awry. Audio and visual hallucinations, mysterious lights appearing in the seawater, feeling someone tapping on the hull, and even sensing someone turning the hatch handle outside. The deeper they went, the more severe these situations became. Even specially trained, strong-willed explorers started to feel immense pressure during each dive, and the protective effects of the holy oil, sacred books, and scripture cloth they carried grew less and less noticeable. Of course, up to this point, this was still within our expectations. Exploring the unknown inherently involves confronting challenges of willpower. Scholars investigating the spirit world and the deep sea often face such difficulties, so we continued, only enforcing the strictest standards for strengthening the explorers' mental defenses. The problem occurred when attempting to reach the 1,000-meter depth from 990 meters. The third submersible suddenly sent an emergency surfacing signal, then, as if it had gone mad, emptied its ballast tanks and raced to the surface. The explorer inside seemed not to care that this rapid ascent would cost him his life. After reaching the surface, he had gone mad. The hatch opened, and he screamed and shouted in the sunlight, as if frantically attempting to describe something horrifying to us. After a lot of incoherent, chaotic speech, he uttered the only comprehensible sentence: "We all died there." Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 252 Inches the Underwater Silence. Duncan paused for a moment in deep thought. He suddenly realized that the dangers and mysteries concealed within the boundless sea were no less formidable in this world's reality. After pondering briefly, he inquired, what happened to that explorer later? He passed away quickly. The rapid ascent and decompression took his life. He screamed and shouted for some time before succumbing to a blood clot. At least that's the cause in the real world. Was he the only crew member in the submersible? Duncan questioned further. No, vel, b, in c ohm. It had room for just one person. While this undoubtedly amplified the explorer's mental pressure, it was also an unavoidable decision. The technology was limited then, and such exploration was ill-suited for multiple people to undertake together. In the ocean, one could never be certain what might take your companion's place at any given moment or whether the sounds you heard were genuine. So diving alone was preferable, at least to avoid doubting the presence of others in the submersible. Deep sea, darkness, solitude, and confronting the enigmatic unknown waters far from civilization, all these factors might have contributed to the explorer's descent into madness. Duncan shook his head slowly, but this is not the crux of the matter. What's essential is, this still doesn't explain why the Abyss plan later became a highly forbidden topic. He locked eyes with Tyrion and continued, so far, all you've recounted is an accident during an exploration. Similar endeavors occur every year. The Academy of Truth even actively supports and encourages scholars and adventurers to participate in these pursuits. This has nothing to do with taboo, nor should it be connected to the vanished. Yes, if the plan had halted at 1,000 meters, the subsequent events would not have transpired. Tyrion shook his head, his emotions stirred by the memories. After the incident with the third submersible, Her Majesty Rhaenora temporarily suspended the exploration, but a few days later, something occurred that made the situation progressively eerie. Duncan furrowed his brow. Something. The third submersible resurfaced at the edge of the temporarily sealed-off test area. Duncan was momentarily taken aback before responding, a third submersible. Yes, a second one, Tyrion confirmed, nodding. It emerged right in front of the naval soldiers and began sending continuous light signals for assistance in opening the hatch. The well-trained soldiers, albeit momentarily bewildered, quickly adhered to standard procedures to haul the submersible onto the work platform and aimed 27 rifles, 2 rapid-fire cannons, and a flamethrower at its hatch. Then, a courageous priest stepped forward, sprinkled holy water, and unlocked the hatch. Tyrion paused momentarily before continuing. The hatch opened, and a person, strikingly similar to the explorer, emerged. Duncan's expression grew serious, strikingly similar. The facial features were similar, but there were differences in height and weight. He was dressed in a frostbite navy uniform, but there were many inconsistencies in the clothing details. More importantly, the person who emerged from the submersible only lived for a brief time on land before passing away. He didn't even have a chance to utter a word. Once the soldiers undressed him, they discovered that his flesh appeared to be fused with the clothes, and there were large and small, inexplicable wounds all over his body. Afterward, doctors and church scholars collaborated to examine the body, and Her Majesty is said to have personally inspected the autopsy scene as well. However, the results of the examination were never disclosed, or rather, before they could announce anything, a third submersible, appeared. At this point, even Alice, who had been attentively listening without speaking, couldn't help but interject, there was a third one. Tyrion instinctively glanced at Alice, his expression somewhat peculiar. He seemed unaccustomed to seeing someone who looked identical to the Frost Queen standing there, exclaiming in astonishment. But he quickly adjusted his expression and nodded gently, the third one, and not just 3. In the following days, a third submersible would surface every 24 or 48 hours. Alice listened in awe to this strange and remarkable story. She pondered for a moment and suddenly blurted out, "So, you just need to wait there, and you can have an endless supply of submersibles." By the way, is that thing called a submersible very valuable? Is it more valuable than cultists? Tyrion, who had been lost in his memories just a moment ago, suddenly found his train of thought interrupted by the doll lady. He opened his mouth for a while but couldn't quite recover his emotions. We hadn't considered that at the time. Don't mind her. Her thought process is unconventional. Duncan glanced at Alice and said gravely to Tyrion, please continue, what happened later? Tyrion collected his thoughts and proceeded. After the third submersible surfaced, it also sent out light signals requesting the hatch be opened. This time, the soldiers were more experienced. They towed the submersible to a more secure containment area, and only after the priests had established numerous supernatural safeguards did they open the hatch. This time, what emerged was a grotesque, swollen, and deformed humanoid creature, utterly unrecognizable as the Explorer. That monster also couldn't survive in the air for more than 3 minutes. From the fourth submersible, a continuously writhing mass of flesh slithered out, devoid of any human characteristics. When the fifth submersible's hatch was opened, nothing emerged. The soldiers at the scene investigated and discovered only a suspicious dark red sludge in the cabin, which exhibited faint signs of life. The sixth submersible contained only a small quantity of black fibrous dry matter, resembling an undeveloped neural structure or desiccated blood vessel specimens. As Tyrion continued recounting the story, Duncan's expression grew increasingly serious. Even Alice, sitting beside him, seemed to perceive the shift in the atmosphere and began to sit up straight. Amid the progressively somber ambiance, Tyrion slowly stated, the seventh submersible, the last one I'm aware of, was empty. Empty. Duncan raised an eyebrow, then shook his head. That's even more disconcerting. Yes, empty, and thus even more unsettling. The situation spiraled out of control, and we needed to find a way to stop it, Tyrion said gravely. Fortunately, the fourth submersible was eventually completed. It was the successor to the third submersible. After the 1,000-meter incident, the project was put on hold, as was its construction. However, as one third submersible after another emerged, the Queen ordered the fourth submersible to be assembled as quickly as possible and decided to use it to investigate what had happened at the 1,000 meters depths. Tyrion paused, seemingly struggling with gaps in his memory. He gathered his thoughts before slowly continuing. I can't recall the specifics of the fourth submersible. It was hastily finished, and the Frostbite Navy was only responsible for part of it. I only know that it was larger than the third, could accommodate 3 people, and had a sample chamber. Scholars had initially planned to use it to gather specimens from the deep sea if any were found. The day after the third submersible surfaced, the Frostbite Kingdom's fourth submersible was launched into the sea. On board were a scholar, an officer, and a powerful priest. At this point, we could no longer care about the risk of having multiple people exploring together. Preventing the appearance of the third submersible, was the top priority. The fourth submersible quickly descended and soon reached a depth of 1,000 meters. The priest on board maintained contact with the surface using psychic power. Perhaps due to the enhanced capabilities of the new submersible, their journey was smooth, and they confirmed the city-state's base scenery as previously observed by the explorer. However, the connection became intermittent soon after, and when the depth reached 1,000 meters, the small church on the surface platform could barely hear any sound coming from the deep sea. Nevertheless, 15 minutes after losing contact, the priest on duty in the small church suddenly heard sounds from the deep sea again. They first heard the onboard priest scream in terror, warning the others, "Don't look. Don't think." Then came the officer's voice, bellowing, followed by a deafening explosion. Tyrion looked up, gazing into Duncan's eyes. The fourth submersible detonated the explosives, the pirate slowly said. They had filled the sample chamber with high-energy explosives to be the last contingency plan. And then, it was all over. The fourth submersible never resurfaced, and no more third submersibles appeared before anyone afterward. Chapter 253 Inches The Frostbite Rebellion. Tyrion's account finally concluded, but Duncan felt the strange tale ended far too suddenly. Is that really it? Just like that, he couldn't help but glance at the pirate in the mirror, his voice laden with doubt. A submarine, loaded with explosives, went 1,000 meters deep and resolved the uncontrolled supernatural phenomenon that was worsening. Let's not even discuss the power of those explosives at that depth. Simply from a supernatural standpoint, could such an explosion even destroy a supernatural phenomenon? We can only speculate. Tyrion seemed unfazed by his father's skepticism. In truth, nobody knows what occurred 1,000 meters below the surface, nor what the fourth submarine witnessed down there. Our only link to the depths was the partial perception the priest shared through psychic resonance, a scream, a roar, and a rumble. These brief fragments revealed little truth. However, after the fourth submarine's explosion, no more third submarine replicas emerged from the deep sea. Thus, we can only assume the issue was resolved. The issue was resolved. Duncan furrowed his brow and shook his head. Fine, let's say it was resolved. What happened to the Abyss plan afterward? The Abyss plan didn't end, and that's the oddest part, Tyrion stated bluntly. After such a costly event that finally resolved the third submarine's mysterious crisis, one would think we should have reevaluated the Abyss plan and halted this perilous endeavor. Yet, Queen Rhaenora disagreed, not only announcing the project's continuation and the construction of a fifth submarine but also elevating the Abyss plan's priority to the highest level, employing an exceptional amount of manpower and resources. Duncan's expression grew serious, as he realized that the truly uncontrolled element of this tale might have only just begun. The charges against the Frost Queen and the rebellion half a century ago all originated from this. He looked intently into Tyrion's eyes. It appears you didn't support your queen at that time. We had heated debates, which is why I mentioned I was no longer directly involved in the Abyss plan, after the 1,000-meter depth. I believed things were headed in a dangerous direction. Tyrion spoke slowly, his voice subdued. But looking back, I should have done everything in my power to stop the Frost Queen, not avoid her. I had too much faith in her and didn't realize she was fallible too. Do you believe the Frost Queen truly made a mistake? Ads by PubFuture. The Abyss plan led to a series of crises under the Frost Queen's reign and provided her adversaries with opportunities to take advantage. This increasingly extreme exploration eventually cost Queen Rhaenora her life. At least from this angle, it was definitely a mistake. What transpired after Rhaenora insisted on continuing the Abyss plan? After that point, I was no longer directly involved with the project and didn't know much about it. However, from what I occasionally heard, the project faced numerous difficulties, and increasingly strange and terrifying incidents began to occur, Tyrion said calmly. The fifth submarine, built with the most advanced engineering technology and durable materials of the time, experienced various accidents during its dives as if something tried to stop humanity from exploring deeper into the ocean. Those involved in the project started losing their minds, experiencing mysterious injuries, or vanishing, only to reappear disoriented in the city center. The explorers who participated in the dives became suspicious and irritable, transforming from disciplined and respectable scholars and soldiers into eerie fanatics. It was even rumored that the fifth submarine itself underwent inexplicable changes during its dives, with its internal workings increasingly resembling a living creature. Despite all these changes and the increasingly alarming atmosphere surrounding the project, the Abyss plan persisted. Those involved, including those plagued by madness, accidents, and injuries, neither had the courage to withdraw nor question or defy orders from above. It was as if Tyrion hesitated, struggling to find the right words to describe the situation. Observing this, Duncan gently added, as if the underwater ocean was calling them. Yes, as if the ocean was calling them, Tyrion agreed, nodding and giving Duncan a peculiar glance. A very accurate description. Don't overthink it. Please continue. Tyrion looked away, gathering his thoughts. It felt as though the entire project was driven and guided by an unseen force, or perhaps the project itself had developed its own will, relentlessly pushing further into the deep sea. Those involved in the project became like individual cells within this vast will. In this atmosphere, the fifth submarine unknowingly reached depths beyond 1,000 meters. I'm not sure how deep it ultimately went, but I heard it was an astounding number, truly remarkable. From an engineering, materials, and technological standpoint of the time, it was an unattainable achievement. Ads by PubFuture. The deep sea embraced the Abyss plan and welcomed the fifth submarine. The increasingly peculiar machine and its equally bizarre crew seemed to effortlessly navigate thousands of meters deep in the dark ocean as if returning home. Meanwhile, around the Abyss plan's vicinity, strange occurrences began to multiply. Merchant ships frequently reported seeing reflections identical to their own vessels near the sea surface. Dense fog often enveloped the eastern frostbite, with shadows resembling ships or enormous creatures drifting within. In the kingdom, a substantial number of strangers appeared, congregating near Abyss plan-related facilities, claiming to be project participants, even outnumbering the actual project members. Under these circumstances, rumors, or rather, they could no longer be considered mere rumors, began to spread everywhere. At first, people claimed that the Frost Queen was conducting suspicious research, but soon, the narrative shifted to her studying subspace. Eventually, it was said that the Frost Queen was colluding with subspace and had already reached an agreement with its mastermind, Captain Duncan. Tyrion took a breath, gesturing with his hands, and then, as you know, the Frostbite rebellion that shocked the North took place. For a moment, the small warehouse filled with antiques fell into silence, only to be broken again by Duncan's calm voice that emerged from the mirror. It's understandable that people connected this with subspace, but linking it to the vanished is a bit too far-fetched. Actually, it's quite a reasonable connection, and it even involves me, Tyrion said with a wry smile, shaking his head. Who would have thought that I am your son, while also loyally serving the Frost Queen and participating in this terrifying project during its early stages? You know, conspiracy theorists always have the wildest imaginations. Duncan neither agreed nor disagreed, and after a brief moment of thought, he said, in that case, the outbreak of that rebellion wasn't entirely unfounded. The Abyss plan that Rhaenora insisted on carrying out was too dangerous, and based on your description, her mental state at the time was indeed questionable. This is precisely what I wanted to mention, Tyrion interjected. I know that all signs pointed to the Frost Queen losing her sanity at the time. She seemed like a madwoman being enticed by something, stubbornly following her own path, but I know that she was always clear-headed, highly rational, and fully aware of her actions. Really, I argued with her, but I was still a trusted general. I could approach her. In fact, other high-ranking city-state officials could too. They all knew that the Queen had never gone mad nor intended to destroy the kingdom or endanger the world. Yes, they knew, but they were afraid, hesitant, and some had been bribed and misled. They weren't as resolute as I was. But I know that perhaps the other participants of the Abyss plan were indeed gradually being influenced by something, but she evidently withstood this influence and exploited it to her advantage. Novelbjn.com. You mean that the Frost Queen actually had a coherent and safe plan, and she was confident about accomplishing it, but she didn't tell anyone, she didn't even explain it to you. Duncan looked thoughtful as he gazed at Tyrion. And you still trust her unconditionally? Because you believe that, even if there is something threatening the city-states deep in the sea, everything is under Rhaenora's control. From your perspective, this trust is probably too blind. Whether it's blind or not is up to you. Duncan shook his head. I just want to say that the Frost Queen evidently couldn't keep everything under control. She ultimately died at the hands of the rebels, and the Abyss plan was entirely buried. Things didn't unfold as she had planned. I really can't argue with that. Tyrion sighed helplessly. Chapter 254 inches. Maybe it's not over. Up until now, Duncan had comprehended the intricacies of the long-lost Abyss plan, which had been concealed for 50 years. He understood its taboo nature and the reason even the instigators of the Frost Rebellion feared it, and rightfully so. Despite unfolding in the real world, the situation escalated beyond its boundaries. An unknown terror lurked deep in the ocean, and ultimately, no one discovered its nature. People continued to lose their sanity, and the entire plan hastened as though plummeting into the abyss. The never-ending descent, the increasingly unsettling atmosphere, and the Frost Queen's almost autistic behavior in the later stages, objectively, even Duncan would instinctively assume that Rhaenora, the original Frost Queen, had been manipulated and controlled by something, suspecting a conspiracy with subspace. Under these conditions, It was worth noting that there were already adversaries of the Queen within Frost, and several city-states in the frigid sea held animosity towards her rule. Even if the northern situation was initially stable, it would eventually escalate over time. Nonetheless, Tyrion consistently maintained that Rhaenyra was never influenced by anything, and he firmly believed that the Frost Queen had been lucid until the end, always safeguarding the city-state. Duncan couldn't determine if Tyrion's assessment was accurate, but he inclined to trust it because he, too, had seen the Frost Queen in historical fragments. Novel in .c own. She had once calmly and logically asked him not to tarnish history. At least from that single encounter, the Frost Queen of that era didn't appear to be a horrifying madwoman under Subspace's control. But because of this, Duncan's curiosity grew. He couldn't comprehend what motive would drive a lucid leader to make such extreme and autistic decisions, continuing to push forward the project at any cost despite knowing the issues with the Abyss plan, and what reasoning led her to keep every secret to herself, not even confiding in her most trusted naval commander. After extensive reflection, Duncan realized all questions ultimately converged on one issue. What mystery did the Frost Queen uncover in the ocean's depths? After the Frost Rebellion, did you ever return to that city-state? Duncan raised his head and questioned Tyrion. No, Her Majesty Rhaenyra commanded me to depart from Frost with my own direct troops. By then, the rebels had already conspired with other northern city-states, assembling an entire fleet in the open sea. Tyrion's tone grew especially somber, as he was clearly reluctant to discuss this past, but if I had defied her and remained, the Frostbite Kingdom would have retained a loyal force to the Queen, and those rebels could never have easily breached the port defenses. Thus, subsequent generations have speculated that you took part in the rebellion. Some even claim that you deliberately allowed the rebels into the Frostbite Kingdom, Duncan said, shaking his head. Have you ever considered why the Frost Queen issued that order initially and whether she provided any further explanation to you? Adds by PubFuture. I've been perplexed by this for many years, Tyrion confessed openly. The Queen gave me no other directives, only to depart with my troops. I thought she might have intended to preserve a force for potential future retaliation, but it didn't add up. She prohibited us from returning to the city-state, and with the rebels in control, how could we exact revenge without going back? You could raid the rebels' fleets in the open sea and intercept all merchant vessels entering and leaving Frost. You did this for several years. Yes, that was the only course of action I could conceive at the time, and it was also the sole means for the Mist Fleet to endure. We didn't even have a home port back then. Tyrion shook his head, but we have gradually ceased these raiding activities. Why? Because the last rebel leader passed away, from old age, Tyrion said with a wry smile, spreading his hands. We persistently sought to apprehend those rebel leaders in every possible manner, hanging them from the mast when captured, then hurling their corpses onto the merchant ships bound for Frost. So they became crafty, hiding in the city-state, never venturing outside the city for decades. I could only watch them die peacefully, one by one, until all those involved in the rebellion had departed this world. Duncan remained silent for a while, deep in thought. Eventually, he abruptly asked, Your soldiers, they're all living dead, correct? Tyrion casually replied, Yes, it's common knowledge. They all directly or indirectly participated in the Abyss plan. I was involved in that plan, and as my direct troops, they naturally took part as well, Tyrion said nonchalantly, then furrowed his brow. Did you come to a conclusion? You were part of the Abyss plan but didn't succumb to madness like the others in the later stages. After 1,000 meters, the Frost Queen disagreed with you and removed you from the plan. Then, on the eve of the rebel assault, your queen specifically instructed you to lead your direct troops away from Frost. Duncan spoke deliberately as he thought, finally fixing his gaze on Tyrion, his voice low. You're correct. The Frost Queen might indeed have wished to retain a force, but it seems she didn't preserve this force for her own vengeance. Tyrion gradually displayed a somewhat surprised expression, but before he could inquire further, the figure in the mirror gently shook his head. Don't ask me, I can't comprehend something you don't understand yourself. I'm merely an observer, voicing my thoughts. A brief quietude settled in the room. After an indeterminate duration, Duncan's voice emerged again. Tyrion, we've conversed long enough this time. Preoccupied with his thoughts, the pirate instinctively raised his head, gazing at his father in the mirror with a hint of astonishment. It was as though he suddenly grasped something, a complicated expression of confusion materializing in his eyes. Ads by PubFuture. It seemed as though he had just recognized how much he had shared with the other party, realizing that he had unknowingly adapted to the conversational atmosphere entirely. Even a century ago, he seldom had such lengthy discussions with his father. As for his initial wariness upon awakening here, it had long since dissipated. He instinctively wanted to say something, but a sharp pain on his forehead made him touch his head involuntarily. That hurts. The child was not gentle. I hope you don't hold it against her. Duncan's voice came from the mirror. Do you need ointment? No need. Tyrion waved his hand with a somewhat odd expression, recalling the last scene he remembered before arriving here, the peculiar little girl, and the creature that flew in like a dog, then suddenly realized, wait, I remember now, that wasn't a dog, that was a dark hound. He looked at the mirror, his eyes filled with disbelief. Is she also one of your subordinates now? Ender cultist. He seemed hesitant when uttering the words, Ender cultist, clearly uncertain of Shirley's true identity. After all, he had encountered beings like Enders before, but he had never seen one wielding a demonic pact weapon. She is indeed carrying out some tasks for me, Duncan said with an enigmatic smile, but if you have the chance to see her again, I suggest you avoid mentioning the term, Enders, in her presence. She doesn't appreciate it. Tyrion made a puzzled sound, then instinctively glanced around, his gaze eventually settling on Alice, who appeared to have begun daydreaming. Alice quickly noticed and curiously looked at Tyrion. Why are you looking at me? Nothing. Tyrion averted his gaze, his complex eyes concealing some indiscernible emotion. Finally, he looked at the mirror still ablaze with flames, asking somewhat hesitantly, so, can I leave now? Would you like to stay for dinner? Tyrion quickly waved his hand. No, that's not necessary. Very well, I'll arrange for my messenger to escort you. Duncan in the mirror nodded, but suddenly, he furrowed his brow as if recalling something. Wait, I just thought of something. Tyrion instinctively became a bit uneasy. Something. Strictly speaking, it's two questions regarding one matter. Duncan's expression turned serious again as he fixed his gaze on Tyrion. Do you recall what you mentioned earlier about several clones of the number 3 submersible surfacing one after another? Of course, Tyrion nodded, including the first original and the subsequent 6 clones, a total of 7, number 3 submersibles surfaced. I have 2 inquiries. Duncan organized his thoughts and slowly began. First, was the initial submersible that surfaced at that time genuinely the original? Second, was the 7th submersible that surfaced truly empty inside? Chapter 255 Inches Farewell for now. Today, half a century after the conclusion of the Abyss plan, Tyrion once again felt a lingering chill from the long-past scheme. The number 3 submersibles resurfaced in his memory as if appearing right before his eyes. Alongside them were the cautious soldiers, solemn priests, and the cold, silent Frost Queen. It was as if he were witnessing the hatches of those submersibles opening once more, revealing the insane explorers, humanoid figures, grotesque deformed creatures, writhing masses of flesh, the eerie, silent mud, the dried and suspicious black fibers, and the empty cabin of the 7th, number 3 submersible. Back then, the platform was heavily guarded by numerous priests and protectors, Tyrion said with a frown, recalling the past. But, I must admit, your question is somewhat unsettling. Duncan remained silent for a few seconds before suddenly asking, what happened to those number 3 submersibles in the end? Except for the first, authentic one that surfaced, the other 6 duplicates were thrown into a furnace, melted into ingots by sacred flames, and then cast into the sea. Despite being valuable metal resources, no one dared to keep them, Tyrion explained hesitantly. But if, as you suggested, even the first one wasn't authentic, then the situation would be. Where is the first one? I don't know its current location. Tyrion shook his head. The rebels should have destroyed everything related to the Abyss plan, but no one knows how they disposed of those materials. Maybe they simply disassembled and recycled them. But before the rebellion, the number 3 submersible was stored in a warehouse at the port after being decommissioned. After a brief silence, Duncan sighed. I understand, Tyrion, thank you for sharing so much with me. Regardless, this information has greatly satisfied my curiosity. However, Tyrion appeared burdened by his thoughts. Reflecting on the Abyss plan, after all these years, he found too many chilling details. Although the plan itself was strange, this retrospective view brought an even more unnerving feeling than when he had experienced it firsthand. Especially considering the recent question his father posed about the Frost Queen's final command, Tyrion felt that this old case, which had supposedly concluded 50 years ago, might not be truly over. But, for now, their conversation had reached its end. His father did not intend to keep him there any longer. A sudden sound of flapping wings came from the side, and Tyrion saw a bird-shaped phantom engulfed in eerie green flames darting through the air. Immediately after, where the phantom had passed, a surge of green flames erupted, spiraling into a vortex gate in an instant. His father's voice emerged from the nearby mirror. Go inside, you'll be transported near the cathedral. I believe you won't tell anyone about what transpired here. Ads by PubFuture. Of course, I've never been one to tattle, Tyrion responded. He glanced at the blazing portal, hesitating for a moment before making up his mind and moving forward. Just before stepping through the gate, he paused and couldn't help but look back at the Gothic doll standing quietly next to the mirror. Anomaly 099, he murmured to himself, she looks exactly like her. It's said that Anomaly 099 first emerged in the icy sea near where the Frost Queen was executed and fell into the water. Duncan's voice came from the mirror. I share your suspicion, but even Alice herself can't explain her origins. As you just mentioned, there's too much in the deep sea that we can't comprehend. Tyrion appeared thoughtful. After a moment of silence, he suddenly spoke up. It seems this doll really enjoys being around you. Duncan responded indifferently. Initially, she stayed out of persistence, but later I found she could be useful. Alice's answer was much simpler. She laughed happily and said, nodding, I like being with the captain. He's incredible. Tyrion looked at his father's emotionless face in the mirror and then at Alice, who resembled the Frost Queen but was entirely different in every other way. After a while, he suddenly laughed. It was a genuine sense of relief and happiness. He then turned around and confidently stepped through the flaming gateway, leaving the warehouse silent again. Alice looked in the direction where the flame had vanished, then turned to gaze at the mirror beside her. It took her a moment to suddenly blurt out, Captain, why did he laugh at us just now? Duncan replied casually, how should I know? Alice, puzzled, asked, what you discussed earlier, about the Frost Queen and the Abyss plan, does it have anything to do with me? This time, Duncan didn't quickly concoct an answer to deceive the doll. He thought about it seriously before saying solemnly, it might be connected. Ads by PubFuture. Can I understand it? It's likely very difficult. Well, then I won't think about it for now. Alice scratched her head and smiled at Duncan in the mirror. Regardless, if there's anything I need to do or help with, just let me know. I will. Great, A burst of fire flashed through the dark alley, and moments later, a groggy Tyrion appeared, spotting the grand doors of planned cathedral nearby. It really did bring me close, the pirate muttered, raising his hand to rub his drowsy head, but accidentally touched the swollen area and immediately winced in pain. That little girl's strength was a bit too frightening. She was a demonic creature heavier than 2 or 3 adults combined. Remembering the cause of the injury on his head, Tyrion couldn't help but grumble internally. Yet, simultaneously, he couldn't help but feel curious. Indeed, his own father was assembling a new crew. From what he had observed so far, he controlled Anomaly 099 and had a mysterious, powerful girl who could summon demonic creatures at his service. However, this was obviously not the full extent of his crew. Even if this had happened yesterday, it would have made him extremely cautious, and he might not have been able to resist alerting the city-state and the church. But at this moment, he had no intention of tattling to the church. Now, his mind was preoccupied with thoughts related to the Abyss plan. Tyrion then approached the Storm Cathedral, and within a few steps, he noticed several figures rushing towards him at the entrance. N-O-V-E in .C. They were the sailors he had sent back earlier. The captain had vanished for an entire day after leaving just a message, which had clearly made his crew anxious. In no time, the sailors reached Tyrion. One began speaking without pause, "You're finally back. The sun is about to set. Where have you been?" Another sailor noticed Tyrion's disheveled state and exclaimed in surprise, "Captain, the wound on your face, and how did your head swell up so much?" Tyrion knew he couldn't conceal his disarray. He had hoped his faster-than-normal healing ability would help him recover before returning to the cathedral. However, it turned out that despite the girl's questionable use of demonic creatures, the injuries they inflicted were still problematic. Half a day had passed, and his head remained swollen. "I tripped along the way." After hesitating for a moment, Tyrion could only offer a feeble excuse. He was too embarrassed to admit to his subordinates that this was the result of fatherly discipline. Furthermore, it wasn't even his father who had directly inflicted the damage, but a young girl who was only about as tall as his chest. "You tripped." The first sailor to speak looked at his boss in confusion. "This seems like quite an exaggerated accident. It's as if you violently smashed your head against the walls of land and the ground." Tyrion stared at the sailor with an intense gaze, emphasizing each word, "I tripped." The sailor shuddered and instantly understood. "Oh, right. You clearly just tripped accidentally. When we get back, I'll help you apply some medicine." "Enough. I don't want to discuss this issue for now." Tyrion sighed and walked towards the cathedral's main entrance. "Let's go back. I need a good rest today, and then we'll set off to return to the north." "Return to the north? Weren't we staying here a few more days? You had planned to." The words, "abyss plan," resurfaced in Tyrion's mind, and he waved his hand. "Enough, it's time to go back. There are still matters to attend to in the cold sea." The sailors exchanged glances and finally nodded, complying with the captain's decision. Tyrion suddenly stopped in his tracks. He hesitated for a moment in front of the main entrance of Storm Cathedral and touched the swollen areas on his face and head. "Let's use the side door." Tyrion instructed his subordinates to leave upon returning to his room, but the silence did little to soothe his unsettled mood. The lengthy discussion with his father continued to linger in his mind, and memories of the abyss plan swirled around his heart uncontrollably. Periodically, images from half a century ago flashed before him. Rudimentary diving gear, perpetually rain-soaked cliffs, silent platform guards, the low prayers of priests on rainy nights, the eerily illuminated coastal laboratory, and the Frost Queen's gaze, forever fixed on the sea, concealing all secrets. Tyrion shook his head. For some reason, he suddenly thought of the puppet who called herself Alice, Anomaly 099, who had entirely broken free from her seal and moved unimpeded in the human world. A controlled anomaly, a puppet who could think and communicate like a human, even possessing her own emotions. She bore a strong resemblance to the Frost Queen, but she was not the queen herself, though her existence and presence evoked thoughts of some kind of return of the queen. Tyrion could sense that Rhaenor's will was absent within the puppet. If anything, Tyrion considered Alice to be more like a perfect exterior replica, yet utterly distorted inside, just like the submersible number 3s that emerged one after another back then. A shiver ran down Tyrion's spine as his mind made these connections. Out of restlessness, he poured himself a glass of potent liquor. He needed the warmth of the alcohol to chase away his chilling thoughts. Then after a while, he felt somewhat better and glanced at the elegant case beside the bed. Hesitantly, he brought the box to the table, opened it, and activated the intricate lenses and the crystal at the center of the lens assembly. NOVELBJN.C Ohm. The crystal sphere illuminated with countless flickering points of light appearing inside, accompanied by irritating noises. Gradually, he saw Lucretia's figure emerge amidst the flickering lights and her indistinct voice. After another couple of minutes, the sound and image finally sharpened, and his sister's voice reached him. "Can you hear me?" "Now it's clear." Tyrion nodded. "The interference on your end is even greater than before. What's around you?" "Is that sunlight? It looks a bit odd." He observed that behind Lucretia, the backdrop seemed to be bathed in a faint golden glow, akin to a radiant sunset streaming through a window. However, the light's warmth and brightness surpassed that of a sunset, and its distribution and diffusion felt somewhat different from sunlight, drawing extra attention. Ads by PubFuture. Tyrion knew that his sister frequently operated at the border, where unusual phenomena often occurred, many of which were hazardous. However, Lucretia always managed to transform danger into safety. Still, he couldn't help but worry slightly. I discovered something peculiar at the border, but I've thoroughly examined it, and there's no danger," Lucretia responded nonchalantly. "The object might have fallen from the sky, casting a vast range of brilliance. I'm using the bright star to tow it back for analysis." Tyrion involuntarily frowned. "You always find peculiar things at the border. Have you forgotten the incident when you were pulled into the spirit world's depths by that human-shaped smoke?" "I'll be cautious, I always have been. But as you know, unavoidable accidents will occasionally occur during adventures." Lucretia waved dismissively, then appeared to suddenly notice something. Staring at Tyrion's face, "Brother, what happened to your face and head?" "I fell. It looks more like you violently collided with a wall." Lucretia's brow furrowed. "You wouldn't have these injuries without a 200-meter run-up and a deliberate headbutt. You were attacked." Tyrion's expression tensed briefly, and then he helplessly shook his head after a moment. "Sometimes I wish you weren't so perceptive." "Who attacked you?" Lucretia ignored Tyrion's attempt to deflect. Her expression was stern. "You're in the planned city-state, where you have no enemies, and the authorities there wouldn't stand by if a guest was assaulted. You just denied being attacked and claimed you fell." As Lucretia spoke, she suddenly halted as if something dawned on her. Her expression shifted dramatically, and she glanced around the crystal ball, her eyes flickering. Tyrion understood her concern upon seeing her reaction and shook his head before she could speak. "Don't worry, he's not here." "Really? Did he hit you?" Lucretia's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, wasn't he supposed to be absent from the city-state? And why would he?" "He's not, it's one of his current underlings," Tyrion said, rubbing his forehead with mild annoyance. "Relax, we didn't have any conflicts. These injuries are just minor accidents. He wanted to discuss some matters with me, and I was overly cautious." Subordinate. Lucretia was startled and instinctively wanted to ask how powerful this underling was and what weapon could reduce the Iron Admiral to such a state. But then she caught Tyrion's latter statement, and her eyes shifted. "He's talking to you again so soon. What happened?" "He's become intrigued by some old matters involving Frost," Tyrion replied casually, "but you don't need to concern yourself with that. I contacted you to ask about something else. Anomaly 099, you're aware of it, right?" Ads by PubFuture. "Of course, I also know the Vanished hijacked it. This incident has spread throughout the Explorers Association." Soon after, the Storm Church issued a notice, and Anomaly 99's name changed from Doll Coffin to Doll. Many people harbor uneasy suspicions about this. Tyrion lifted his eyelids and gazed intently into Lucretia's eyes. "Do you know why its name changed from Doll Coffin to Doll?" Lucretia knit her beautiful brows as if she were sensing something. "I met her," Tyrion exhaled without prolonging the suspense. "That doll, she calls herself Alice, and she has awakened from the coffin. She now serves at our father's side, and just like the rumors, the doll bears an uncanny resemblance to the Frost Queen, but her personality is quite astonishing." "This revelation is quite surprising," Lucretia said softly. In the inexplicable golden light, her eyes seemed to shimmer faintly. "So, you're saying Father liberated Anomaly 099 from the coffin, allowing the hazardous anomaly to wander freely outside, and she willingly follows Father. She can even converse with you." "It's hard to believe, but it's true," Tyrion confirmed. "She can speak, think, and feel emotions like a human. In fact, I sense she has a good rapport with Father, but I can't be certain if it's a connection humans can comprehend, considering one is a ghost returned from subspace, and the other is an anomalous object, ranked within the top 100. Lucretia remained silent. After a brief pause, she looked up. "What do you want to ask?" "About the circumstances when Anomaly 099 was first discovered. You were present at the scene." Tyrion gazed at his sister. "I want to hear the most genuine details from you. As you know, my fleet and I never approached Frost. We weren't there back then." Lucretia hesitated for a few seconds. "That year, I was indeed in the area of the incident, but it wasn't the bright star that first retrieved Anomaly 099. it was a coastal fishing vessel named Charlwyn. Strictly speaking, by the time I received Charlwyn's distress signal and located the out-of-control, adrift fishing boat, it was already the second scene, so I can't confirm what the initial scene was like when Anomaly 099 was first recovered. I can only tell you what I observed on Charlwyn. Lucretia paused momentarily, recalling the events she had witnessed. When I discovered the boat, nearly all the crew had perished. Of the 12 members, including the captain, 11 had been decapitated. Only a semi-deranged sailor remained, describing the cursed wooden box they had salvaged. He claimed they couldn't discard the box because it was alive, moving around the boat. Nor could they destroy it since it was incredibly resilient and sturdy. The sailors with self-defense weapons were no match for it. As for this part, you can essentially find it in the Explorers Association's public records, but there is one detail, not documented in the files, which might pique your interest. Within half an hour of initially salvaging Anomaly 099, the sailors aboard Charlwyn heard a series of faint clicking sounds emanating from the box. It was as if something was assembling itself inside. Faint clicking sounds, Tyrion murmured, furrowing his brow. He appeared to want to inquire further, but just as he was about to speak, an abrupt and slightly urgent bell rang from outside the window, interrupting him. Surprised, he looked up, listening to the distinct and pressing bell chime in the gradually darkening sky. Then, after carefully discerning it for a moment, he uncertainly murmured to himself, "Not the evening bell, it sounds like rapid rings." Rapid bells, Lucretia's voice came from the crystal ball. "I heard 7 short rings. If I recall correctly, that's the bell signal representing the tomb of the nameless king, isn't it?" The urgent bell rang rapidly, sounding 7 short rings in succession, followed by a brief pause and another 7 rings before repeating this pattern thrice. Tyrion listened closely to the sounds coming through the window. He could hear conversations echoing in the corridor and hurried footsteps from the open space. These were the commotions caused by the senior priests running around to establish protection at crucial spots for the night watch. At the same time, the highest-ranking individual in the cathedral should have already retreated to a hidden sanctuary, getting ready to participate in the saints' gathering. Although Tyrion wasn't a church member, he had lived for half a century and was well acquainted with its rules. He could deduce vital information from the frequency and repetition of the bell sounds. It signaled a listening assembly, an invitation sent directly from the tomb of the nameless king, and it seemed quite urgent. Could there be an issue with an anomaly or a vision? Is it a new discovery, or has an old one changed significantly? Lucretia pondered aloud. It feels like it hasn't been long since the last call. Tyrion listened to the commotion outside for a while longer before refocusing his attention and shaking his head. "This is the Storm Church's own affair, we don't need to interfere." Lucretia nodded gently, then looked at her brother. "Do you have any more questions about Anomaly 099? Tyrion considered for a moment and shook his head. "No, that's all. Besides, with the urgent bell ringing this evening, the cathedral will soon enter a state of night watch, so it's best not to continue discussing matters related to anomalies." "All right, then I'll carry on with my own tasks," Lucretia promptly said. The crystal ball on the table began to flicker slightly, and her figure started to fade. But just before the connection was severed entirely, she recalled something and suddenly said, "Oh, there's one more thing, about our father." Tyrion hesitated slightly. "Go ahead. Did he appear normal when he came to see you this time?" "He was very lucid, clear-headed, and even somewhat." Tyrion hesitated but ultimately continued, "I can't be certain, but he seemed almost affectionate." "Ah, that's good, ads by PubFuture." Vanna rushed into the cathedral and spotted Bishop Valentine already waiting for her in front of the goddess's statue. She hurriedly approached and asked, "Why is there another call so soon? This has never happened before." "I don't know, but this time the bell ringing is directly controlled by the Storm Cathedral, so it must have a reason." Valentine nodded at Vanna, and as they walked toward the passage leading to the flooded cave, he spoke quickly. "Like last time, it might be due to direct changes in the list of anomalies and visions, with the tomb keeper sending out a summons." Vanna followed the elderly bishop's footsteps. As she passed the statue of the goddess, She hesitated for a moment but soon bowed respectfully as she had always done before continuing toward the passage's entrance. Before long, they were at the flooded cave used for constructing the psychic channel. The scene in the secret chamber remained unchanged, with the ancient stone walls perpetually damp and the fire basin in the center burning with an ethereal flame. It's tranquil in here, masterfully created by the sounds of trickling water and echoing waves. Then, the door to the secret chamber slammed shut. "No-vel-b in.c ohm." Vanna took a deep breath, paused before the fire basin, and lowered her head to gaze at the flames that burned without fuel. She attempted to calm her thoughts, gradually synchronizing her spirituality with the guidance of the goddess as the leaping flame filled her vision. This process should have been routine, but Vanna found it quite difficult this time as she tried to not imagine the flames turning a ghostly green or the possibility of Captain Duncan's eyes hiding behind the shadows. Wanting help, she glanced at Bishop Valentine, who had already closed his eyes and breathing steadily, a sign that he had already entered the assembly. Vanna reluctantly looked away, took a deep breath, and tried to concentrate her spirit once more, synchronizing her spirituality with the guidance of the goddess. Fortunately, she succeeded this time. Ethereal seawater swirled around her, gently enveloping her senses as they detached from the mortal body. Vanna momentarily felt disoriented before finding herself in the mysterious ancient assembly hall. The familiar boundless square, the ancient broken pillars surrounding it, and the vague human-shaped shadows gathered between the pillars filled her sight. Ads by PubFuture. One of the shadows quickly approached her. It was Bishop Valentine. "Vanna, did you have trouble? It took you longer this time." "My mind wasn't focused enough," Vanna replied casually. She then noticed a striking figure standing at the edge of the square, a clear and beautiful woman dressed in a magnificent robe, quite different from the other blurred shadows of the saints. Vanna, of course, recognized the figure. "Hope Helena is here in person?" she asked in surprise. "I really picked a bad time to be late." "It's all right, you'll get used to being late," Valentine said nonchalantly. "She was already here when I arrived. She might even have been the first one here. I suppose she might have some special arrangements." Vanna listened half-heartedly, feeling as if the clear and elegant figure was casting an almost imperceptible gaze their way. This kind of attention made her feel uncomfortable and even nervous. Just then, Hope Helena turned her head. She looked at Vanna earnestly, and a hint of a smile appeared before she nodded gently. Vanna was momentarily stunned. She was about to return the gesture when a sudden, deep rumble interrupted her. Looking in the direction of the sound, she saw the stone floor in the center of the square rapidly rise. The shattered ground rippled like water, and within moments, an ancient palace made of pale giant stones appeared before the saints. The tomb of the nameless king had emerged. The saints, who had been whispering amongst themselves, quickly fell silent, and an atmosphere of solemnity enveloped the square. Vanna also hurriedly collected her thoughts, ignoring the Pope's gaze, and focused intently on the pyramid-shaped main building of the ancient palace and its entrance. The entrance opened, and the towering tomb guardian stepped out. Wrapped in burial cloth, with half of its body burned and the other half entwined in chains, the horrifying creature made of flesh, steel, and deadly curses strode straight towards the saints gathered in the square, just as it had the previous time. Ads by PubFuture. The chosen one had been decided. The next moment, without any hesitation, it bypassed every shadow in the square and stopped directly in front of Vanna. The tomb guardian lowered its head, its single eye calmly staring at the saint before it. "You may enter the tomb." It raised its hand, offering a quill and parchment, awaiting Vanna's response. Vanna was stunned, as were almost all of the saints. The tomb guardian had chosen the same saint to enter the tomb twice in a row. This had never happened in the past 1,000 years. Of course, there were no explicit rules preventing the tomb guardian from choosing the same saint consecutively. However, over the years, the guardian had always chosen different saints to enter the tomb during nearby assemblies, which had become an unwritten rule. Even if a saint who had previously entered the tomb attended the assembly again, it was merely to follow orders and ensure the completeness of the listening ritual. No one expected Vanna to be chosen again. Vanna hesitated for several seconds, and the tomb guardian patiently waited with an outstretched hand. At that moment, She felt someone's gaze again. The lady instinctively followed the sensation, only to meet Pope Helena's deep eyes. Vanna's heart tightened, and she guiltily looked away, only then noticing that the tomb guardian was still waiting. The ancient, seemingly terrifying guardian calmly lowered its head and extended the parchment and quill a little further. "Me again?" Vanna asked subconsciously but immediately regretted it. Why would the tomb guardian answer such an irrelevant question? However, she then heard a hoarse, low voice coming from in front of her. "Yes, you again." Vanna was taken aback, and she looked up at the tomb guardian's slightly fearsome face before taking the parchment and quill. The tomb guardian seemed to nod slightly and said as it straightened up, "Please write what you heard on it." Vanna nodded instinctively but suddenly felt that something was amiss. It seemed that the tomb guardian had become considerably more courteous. Not only did Vanna vaguely sense something was off, but the nearby saints also detected a disturbance. Their ethereal soul projections unconsciously glanced at the ancient being enshrouded in cloaks, its appearance ghastly and horrifying. In their memories and the church's records, all descriptions of this tomb guardian were accompanied by terms like cold, dutiful, indifferent. Never had any record mentioned that he would utter "please" to the chosen listener. Nonetheless, Vanna had no time to dwell on this. She saw the tomb guardian waiting patiently for her, so she quickly collected her thoughts and nodded, "All right." The tomb guardian turned and guided Vanna toward the grand, ancient tomb palace, leaving the saints in the square to watch the pair vanish into the distance. Once the massive tomb doors shut behind them, seemingly sealing off the sounds of the outside world, Vanna's heart steadied within the chilly, silent corridor. This was her second time entering this tomb. In contrast to her initial apprehensive and tense emotions, she had now somewhat acclimated to it. She knew the path. To continue straight, traverse the corridor filled with messages from her predecessors, enter the innermost chamber, and behold the body of the nameless king. Then, she would forget everything she had seen and heard before being transported outside the tomb, while the parchment in her hand would hold the notes she had personally documented. The secrets forbidden to leave the tomb would be stripped away, while those that could be shared with the world would remain. The corruption she experienced while acquiring knowledge would be safely left behind in the tomb chamber, accompanied by her forgetfulness. Vanna composed herself and took a step forward, only to halt in surprise upon hearing heavy footsteps following from behind. Under normal circumstances, the tomb guardian would depart once the listener entered the tomb, but this wasn't the case. "Is there anything else?" Vanna couldn't help but inquire, her tone cautious and defensive. The tomb guardian looked downward, his single exposed eye exuding a murky gaze, and a raspy voice emerged from his chest. "No, just escorting. Do you require an escort?" Ads by PubFuture. Her unease intensified. Although Vanna had only entered the tomb once and was not well versed in all details related to Vision 004, she instinctively sensed that the tomb guardian's behavior seemed somewhat off, a stark contrast to the records. Nevertheless, Vanna remained composed. She was acutely aware that she was in an ancient vision of high rank, and every detail here was vital to her survival. Consequently, she exercised extreme caution and did not impulsively accept the tomb guardian's additional service. "I think I know the way." The tomb guardian silently gazed at the visitor before him, his single eye revealing no emotion. After a few seconds, he merely nodded and slowly retreated. "All right, please proceed, and I will escort you out when you are finished." The tomb guardian's figure vanished into the corridor, leaving the lady dumbfounded for a moment before Vanna realized the guardian had used the word "you" at the end. Why was this cold and aloof ancient guardian so courteous today? She shook her head, striving to dispel all distracting thoughts from her mind, worried that this ancient vision might induce some mental disturbance. Focusing on her task, she proceeded through the lengthy corridor and entered the tomb chamber deep within the palace. Inside the chamber, the enigmatic headless corpse continued to occupy the towering throne, with ghostly fire basins burning on either side. Facing the nameless king's body was a chair that had evidently been moved there recently. Vanna's eyelids flickered. In that instant, the typically serious and disciplined inquisitor entertained a rather absurd notion: would a fruit plate be added the next time she visited? She approached the chair and cautiously sat down, then raised her eyes to the headless corpse on the throne. The following second, she opened her eyes to find herself standing in the vast, open stone square. The turbulent sky filled her sight, mysterious lights emanating from the shattered pillars in the distance, and a rumbling noise originated from behind her. Vision 004 rapidly descended back into the ground. Still somewhat dazed, Vanna noticed the saints in the square had swiftly gathered. Ads by PubFuture. An ethereal saint, carrying the familiar aura of Valentine, approached Vanna with urgency. Quickly, see what's recorded on the parchment. Vanna snapped back to reality, hastily picking up the parchment in her hand. As anticipated, this parchment was still incomplete, but compared to the previous one, which had only a small fragment remaining, the situation had improved considerably. Only half of the parchment was missing, while the remaining portion contained legible writing. Vanna's eyes scanned her own handwriting. Shadows in the deep darkness have begun to rise. The day of setting sail. Vision. Planned. The saints exchanged glances, and Valentine's saintly apparition gazed at Vanna in astonishment, instinctively wanting to ask something but uncertain how to phrase it. There was a significant issue with the parchment's content. However, the listener couldn't recall her experience in the central tomb chamber, and the text that could be brought out on the paper was the only information available. Vision 004 wouldn't provide any further answers. The sole guarantee was the accuracy and truthfulness of the parchment's content. Shadows in the deep darkness. The day of setting sail. A saint couldn't help but murmur, looking perplexed at his counterparts. The information conveyed from the tomb in the past was relatively precise and unambiguous. Rarely were there such vague metaphors. Perhaps this is precise and unambiguous information, just that the key part was torn away, another saint mused. Rather than that, the content of the last sentence is. Ads by PubFuture. Vision. Planned, someone whispered softly. Vanna's gaze was also fixed on the last sentence of the parchment. Among the three sentences, only this one had completely captured her attention. She naturally thought of the Great Fire, the ghost ship, and the ghostly flames that eventually engulfed the entire city-state. But then, she noticed something else. No number, she said in surprise, then looked up at Valentine and repeated, no number. At this moment, she didn't even know which point to be more surprised at first, whether to be surprised that Planned had been identified as a vision, or to be surprised that this vision had no number. The saints were somewhat restless. Although they were high-ranking clergy from various church regions with strong wills and powerful forces, they couldn't help but fall into confusion and bewilderment. The low, uneasy discussions echoed around them, and some more familiar saints approached Vanna and Valentine, inquiring about the recent situation in Planned. This made Vanna feel somewhat helpless. Compared to the experienced Bishop Valentine, she was still too young. Fortunately, the commotion lasted only a short while, and the saints gathered in the square suddenly quieted down. Vanna looked up and saw the shadowy figures retreating to the sides while an elegant lady dressed in a luxurious robe walked toward her and Bishop Valentine. November, LBJNN. They immediately bowed at the newcomer. Your Holiness. No need for formalities. The ruler of the Storm Church, the storm goddess's representative in the mortal world, Pope Helena, looked at Vanna, then at the parchment. May I take a look? Of course. Vanna quickly handed over the parchment. Here you are. Helena took the parchment, her eyes scanning the text, then looked up at Vanna with a faint smile. The handwriting is quite nice, much better than the writing in your report. Vanna was taken aback, not expecting the Pope to suddenly bring this up, and then she felt a little embarrassed. That report, I wrote it in a hurry. The city-state was in a bit of chaos at the time. I understand. When I first wrote such a long report, I almost wanted to eat the pen, Helena said with a smile. So the typewriter is a good invention, why not use it? Vanna replied with a strange tone. I always accidentally break it, and I'm not used to it. Helena's smile became even more evident, and then she handed the parchment back to Vanna, casually saying, I've already read all the reports you submitted about the historical pollution incident in Planned, including the part about the vanished. Frankly, after experiencing such a drastic change, it's not surprising that the city-state of Planned has become a place similar to a vision. Although the birth process of this vision is extraordinary, being extraordinary is the nature of anomalies and visions. She paused for a moment, and her expression gradually grew serious. However, Having no number is a bit too extraordinary. Ever since Vision 004 introduced the first list to the present world, all anomalies and visions had been assigned numbers. Despite changes in position, evolving characteristics, or the disappearance or transformation of some anomalies and visions, there was always an empty space on the list to account for them. For millennia, this rule remained unaltered. Thus, people believed that Vision 004 served as a focus, transcending the order of time and space. All anomalies and visions, whether from the past or future, had left their marks within this focal point. Even if they had not yet come into existence, their positions were preordained. However, this long-standing rule was broken today with the appearance of an unnumbered vision that emerged before everyone. Adding to the unease, this vision was known as planned, the pearl of the boundless sea, the most thriving stop on the ocean trade network, and the largest gathering place of Storm Church believers. Yet, for some reason, Vanna sensed that the Pope, who maintained a serene and introverted demeanor, didn't appear overly concerned. When plan became a vision, she exhibited only mild surprise. She seemed less concerned with plan becoming a vision than with plan being unnumbered. Anxiously, Vanna glanced at the Pope, who seemed lost in thought. Following a few minutes of heavy silence, she suddenly inquired, "What has become of plans since the disaster?" "Order is being re-established in the city-state, and all who perished from historical pollution, as well as damaged locations, have been restored, save for those who truly died 11 years ago," Bishop Valentine promptly replied. "We have inspected every nook and cranny of the city-state, including every sewer, factory, machine, and even each pipe, and found no signs of supernatural distortion. The city-state is in an incredibly normal state." "Well, except for the French fry issue, correct?" Helena interjected indifferently. "I saw it in the report." Vanna's expression turned somewhat awkward. "I know it's a bit odd to include that in the report." "It's not odd. Following a supernatural event, all leads must be taken seriously," Helena calmly asserted, her gaze landing on Vanna. "So, what about you, Saint Vanna? Have you sensed anything amiss?" Vanna grew subconsciously uneasy, anticipating that the Pope would eventually ask her this question since she had documented everything in the report, apart from the shaken faith segment. "I actually don't feel anything unusual. No spiritual pollution, no mental distortion. Bishop Valentine specifically conducted several tests on me, and the conclusion was that it's merely a connection." Helena slightly clenched her fists, resting her chin on her fist, appearing to ponder for a moment before addressing the saints gathered nearby. "Everyone, disperse for now. I have matters to discuss with the two saints from Planned." Ads by PubFuture. Upon hearing this, the shadows assembled in the square paid their respects to the Pope and disappeared one by one. In under half a minute, only Helena, Vanna, and Valentine remained in the expansive assembly area. "You appear slightly anxious, young saint. Relax," Helena said, smiling at Vanna after the area had quieted. "You are on the right path, and the goddess's approval and favor remain as steadfast as ever. Don't be uneasy merely because you've encountered some dangerous powers. As defenders of order, isn't it our responsibility to handle all sorts of dangerous powers?" Taking a gentle breath, Vanna tried to keep her voice steady. "Indeed, as you said." Helena nodded and shifted her gaze to Bishop Valentine. "I saw in your report that you believe the renowned Captain Duncan has regained his sanity and humanity, and there's potential for communication. Technically speaking, it's not just the potential for communication. We are already establishing communication. Though the beginning was unplanned," Valentine nodded slightly and stated solemnly. "For some reason, the Ghost Captain is particularly interested in the situation in Planned and has chosen Vanna as the contact. So far, he has shown no hostility towards the civilized world." "Did the fire from the vanished engulf the entire city-state?" Helena inquired immediately. Valentine nodded in affirmation. "Yes, the fire expelled the historical pollution created by the heretics and reset the city-state to its pre-pollution state. Alternatively, one could argue that the fire tainted the entire city-state and rendered it untainted," Helena calmly remarked, locking eyes with Valentine. "In this situation, the distinction between polluted and unpolluted has become rather ambiguous." Valentine subconsciously exchanged glances with Vanna beside him. They then heard Helena continue. This might be why plan became a vision. The parchment doesn't detail the specific attributes of this new vision, but we can venture a description. Vision planned. The city reduced to ashes by subspace flames, was reshaped into a normal appearance by Duncan Abnomar's power. Its distortion lies in distorting its own distortion. The entire city functions as though it had never been polluted, and the sole remaining evidence of the pollution is its existence. Helena paused, silently studying the two saints before her. A coin with its head side up, flipping through the air, and still landing with its head side up. Vanna seemed about to say something, but the Pope gently waved her hand, stopping her. November LBJNN. Ads by PubFuture. However, there's nothing wrong with that, Saint Vanna. Compared to the twisted states of most places in our world, what does it matter if a coin still shows its head side up after flipping? Helena said lightly. At least, in reality, plan continues to exist. Whether the coin flipped once or countless times, it's not something we mortals should be concerned about. For some reason, Vanna sensed a hidden meaning in Pope Helena's words but couldn't yet comprehend it. She simply furrowed her brow. So, how should we announce this news? And how do we explain to people that they live in an immense vision, while still enabling them to maintain a normal life after learning this fact? A startling revelation resulting from an abrupt change should either remain undisclosed or be announced when the aftershocks have yet to subside. People are most receptive during the initial aftershock, Helena asserted solemnly. At present, the citizens of Planned have not fully escaped the disaster's aftermath and have not entirely immersed themselves in the return to normal life, so proceed with the announcement as usual. However, exercise caution in guiding people, helping them understand the distinctiveness of this vision. Not all visions are dangerous, and always remember that our world is still sustained today by the illumination of Vision 001. Yes, Bishop Valentine bowed his head. I will consult with the City Hall on this matter, determining the most prudent way to announce this news. Helena nodded, her gaze inadvertently drifting over Vanna before adding, there are a few more things. Vanna and Valentine immediately responded, please instruct us. Helena hesitated momentarily. It's not that urgent, we'll discuss it in greater detail when we meet. It took Vanna a couple of seconds to suddenly understand Helena's implication. Meet, are you going to? The Grand Storm Cathedral has been touring for many years, it's about time to make a stop, Helena said, smiling at Vanna. Prepare yourselves. The Grand Storm Cathedral will arrive in Planned within a week. By then, I can witness for myself the posture this coin has taken after flipping. The two saints departed, leaving only Helena's figure standing in the vast assembly hall. But merely half a minute later, quivering shadows emerged from the nearby darkness, and the tall, thin, elderly leader of the Death Church, Banster, along with the kind-faced, slightly overweight leader of the Truth Academy, Loon, materialized from the shadows and stood before Helena. Banster glanced in the direction Vanna had left before shifting his focus back to the Storm Pope. Is it her? She seems ordinary. But the ruler of the storm chose her, Helena replied calmly. It is the will of the goddess. The plump, kind-faced Loon contemplated for a moment before speaking with inquisitively, but why did the ruler of the storm choose her? Number one can decipher the intentions of the storm. Helena gently shook her head before changing the topic. Let's not dwell on this. Let's discuss the information revealed by Vision 004 this time, an unnumbered vision, which is far more perplexing than the vision itself. After an indeterminate period of silence that hung over the air, Pope Banster of the Death Church finally broke the air. Anomalies and visions that diverge from the norm will always arise as irregular occurrences. Eternal Zero is certainly useful, but it shouldn't be employed recklessly, said the short, plump, and affable Loon. Then shaking his head, we can't apply the Eternal Zero law to everything we don't comprehend. Doing so would make us complacent when a genuine crisis arises, causing us to miss crucial opportunities. NOVELBJN.C. Ohm. Are you implying that the information provided by Vision 004 is unreliable? Banster asked, tilting his head slightly. Is it not that Vision Planned lacks a numerical code, but rather that it's concealed? It might be an entirely new naming scheme, Loon mused. Vision 004 and Vision Planned might both be accurate, but we have yet to grasp this new vision naming method. Planned has undergone some highly unusual events recently, a city-state tainted by history but rescued by subspace power, something unprecedented. I don't appreciate new mechanisms. Banster shook his head, his voice low. New mechanisms imply new uncontrollable factors. We've sacrificed so much to understand the world, and yet it continues to change. No one enjoys it, but the world is consistently cruel. Loon shrugged, turning to Helena. I hope you can learn something in Planned and witness firsthand what has transpired in that city-state. Helena remained quiet for a moment, nodding slightly, seemingly deep in thought. Eventually, she broke the silence. There's another issue, you must have noticed it as well, the problem with Vision 001. Loon's expression grew serious, a rare occurrence for the elderly man who served the god of wisdom. Yes, the solar observation tower has verified that the rune ring on the sun's periphery has indeed sustained damage. Although the missing section represents only a small fraction of the entire rune structure, that portion is undeniably gone. I am still monitoring Vision 001 closely, but there's no further damage to the rune ring or any indication of self-repair. No unusual activities have been detected among the sun worshippers, Banster added promptly. Initially, I suspected their involvement, but based on the information we've gathered, the sun heretics themselves don't seem to have noticed Vision 01's changes. That doesn't mean it's unrelated to the creeping sun wheel, Helena stated gravely. The creeping sun wheel is among the oldest entities in this world, and the sun heretics are merely mold spots that have grown under its influence. Their connection to their deity isn't as intimate as they believe. We'll continue monitoring those cultists and the sun's heir offsprings behind them, Banster declared slowly. As well as the doomsday enders. In any event, what occurred in Planned must not be repeated. Helena nodded slightly, watching as the shadows of the two popes faded and dissipated into the darkness, vanishing into the void. She turned her gaze towards the spot where the tomb of the nameless king had sunk, and soon, her figure gradually disappeared from the assembly hall as well. Ads by PubFuture. The next moment, Helena opened her eyes to the physical realm, stepping out of the secret chamber when two attendants approached. Helena waved her hand, signaling for them to leave, and proceeded alone down the lengthy corridor towards the upper deck of the cathedral ship. A grand cathedral sailed upon the vast, boundless dark sea, with the cathedral's 3 spires and towering pinnacles and bell towers reaching for the heavens. Their tops were enveloped in mist, while the lower half of the cathedral ship consisted of heavy armor, enormous pipes, and the rugged mechanical structure connecting to the deck area. A colossal ark, the lower half a steel fortress and the upper half a sacred cathedral, this was the true headquarters of the Storm Church, the Grand Storm Cathedral, navigating the boundless sea. Helena emerged from the corridor that's adorned with sacred runes, and arrived at the terrace on the upper deck, quietly surveying the magnificent feat of engineering below her. This cathedral was relatively new. In fact, its hull had been finished a mere 35 years ago, and its upper structure had been completed only 20 years prior. Scholars from the Academy of Truth had aided in designing the cathedral ship's immense power system and intricate control mechanisms, and thus far, everything had operated seamlessly. Before the cathedral ship's completion, the Grand Storm Cathedral was smaller in scale and spent less time sailing the boundless sea. For the Maiden of Storm and Tranquility, she didn't object to her followers seeking assistance from other religions to construct their temple, and neither did the other gods. In truth, the gods were indifferent to anything that transpired in the mortal world. Helena took a gentle breath, observing the thin mist surrounding the cathedral ship. This layer of mist and the chaotic darkness of the nearby seawater signified that the entire ark was currently navigating between the realms of reality and the spirit world. In this position, most ordinary ships sailing on the boundless sea could not detect the Grand Storm Cathedral's presence. After quietly savoring the cold breeze for a while, Helena reached out, grasped a hand-carved wooden piece shaped like a wave, and took it from her side. Once she's done invoking the name of the storm goddess, Gomona, she casts the wave amulet made of sea breath wood, far into the sea. The faith of the saint you're concerned about has started to waver. Helena looked in the direction of the plummeting amulet, speaking softly as if to herself, but her humanity seems to remain unblemished. She is still human. The waves gently rippled as if invisible whispers were softly echoing through the waters. Helena listened attentively for a long time and nodded gently. That's good, yes, I understand. After having floated on the water's surface for a while, the sea breathwood amulet eventually tumbled and silently sank into the boundless sea. Ads by PubFuture. Inside the antique shop of Plant, the morning sun was brilliant today as the light poured through the freshly cleaned windows and onto the scattered shelves housing the faux relics. As cheerful as ever, Nina hummed an upbeat tune as she dusted the merchandise, occasionally peeking out to watch the figures near the counter as she did so. Alice and Shirley had been sitting there, their brows furrowed and holding a stack of alphabet cards, while Dog hid in the shadows near the counter, trying to write words with a pencil grasped in his paw. Truthfully, Nina found it amazing that Dog could even hold a pencil with his skeletal paw. From her view, it would be challenging to keep a grip. On the brink of falling asleep for the third time, Shirley yawned widely, placed the alphabet cards on the counter, and looked at Alice, who was entirely focused. Aren't you sleepy? No, not really. Alice raised her head and replied honestly, I don't know what it feels like to be sleepy. I only sleep when it's time to sleep. I wonder what it's like to be a living doll with a soul, Shirley mumbled, then cautiously looked around and stealthily glanced upstairs before whispering, Hey, why hasn't Mr. Duncan come down today? And when I saw him this morning, he seemed preoccupied. Alice put the alphabet cards she had just memorized to the side, picked up a clean one, and began to recite again while saying absent-mindedly, He's pondering the mysteries of the deep sea. Pondering the mysteries of the deep sea. Shirley was puzzled. What does that mean? I don't know. That's what he said. Alice shook her head slightly. Why don't you go ask him? He should be happy to teach you something. Shirley opened her mouth, about to say something when suddenly, she heard the sound of Dog panicking from the shadows near the counter. If you want to court death, don't drag me with you. I didn't say I was going to ask. Shirley glared in the direction of the voice. I still have to. She had just gotten halfway through her sentence when she suddenly heard the crisp sound of a bell from the direction of the door. Dog instantly vanished, while Alice gracefully set her alphabet cards aside and looked up towards the door. Welcome, may I? Oh. Mr. Morris. The person who had arrived early in the morning was Morris. The elderly scholar wore a dark winter coat, a thick round-topped felt hat, and carried a hefty, old tome under his arm. After entering, he greeted Alice and Shirley by the counter and then glanced at Nina, who was tidying up the shelves nearby. Is Mr. Duncan here? He's upstairs. Nina nodded, looking curiously at the old man. Do you need him for something? I think I found the origin of that symbol. Morris excitedly waved the ancient book he had brought with him. It's unbelievable that it appeared in a document about the ancient kingdom of Crete, and so inconspicuous.